The story begins with a mysterious and captivating alien princess left stranded in a hostile desert, her ethereal beauty both a blessing and a curse. Abandoned by her alien kin, she awakens, unsure of her purpose, but humans soon discover her existence, each encounter escalating the stakes. Once you approve this start, I'll begin writing it out in detail. Next, let me know if this direction works for the first part. This will ensure we stick to the right rhythm and engage viewers while adhering to your prompt. I'll also maintain suspense and build upon human ingenuity, determination, and creativity as the story unfolds. The sun scorched the horizon as waves of heat shimmered above the endless dunes. Beneath the unyielding sky, a figure lay still in the sand, her body a contradiction to the desert's harshness, untouched by the dust and blistering winds. She was an alien princess. Her kind had left her behind, nude and exposed to this foreign world. Her skin radiated an iridescent glow, as if the light of distant stars lived within her. Long strands of silver-blue hair scattered over her shoulders, swaying with the warm breeze. Her form, though alien, exuded a beauty so profound that it seemed beyond what mortal beings could comprehend. The first thing she noticed was the silence. No whispers from her star-bound people, no echoes from her mother's cold orders. Only the lonely winds answered her now. She pushed herself upright, her eyes wide and uncertain, the color of emerald seas back on her home planet. Confusion clouded her thoughts. Why was she abandoned here? Her people had been calculating, cold in their decisions, viewing beauty not as a gift, but a tool. Her very presence was dangerous, so her mother had warned. Beauty, unrestrained, could twist the minds of mortals, she said. And now, here she was, discarded in a desert where human hearts, curious and unpredictable, would find her. Her bare feet sank into the shifting sands, and she stood, fragile but defiant. Each step felt foreign, no comforting gravity of her homeworld, only a persistent force that tried to pull her down. The princess looked to the horizon, as if seeking answers beyond the endless expanse. That's when the humans arrived. From a distance, two figures on horseback appeared as hazy silhouettes under the relentless sun. They were explorers seeking fortune or relics of the past. But instead, they found her. Their horses slowed as the men came closer. Their eyes widened, stunned by what they saw. They expected to stumble upon a mirage, a fleeting vision created by exhaustion. Yet there she stood, untouched, vulnerable, and surreal. The younger of the two men, a wanderer named Julian, couldn't speak at first. His heart stuttered, torn between awe and disbelief. He was a scavenger by trade, used to picking through ruins and scavenging lost technology. But this was beyond anything he'd ever seen. Who are you? Julian finally managed to stammer, his voice uncertain as if speaking to a dream. The alien princess tilted her head slightly, studying him with a gaze full of both innocence and otherworldly depth. Though she did not speak his language, the emotion in her eyes said enough: curiosity, fear, and perhaps a faint flicker of hope. The older man, Elias, had sharper instincts. His gaze hardened, realizing the dangerous potential in this encounter. "We can't leave her here," Elias muttered under his breath, glancing around the barren desert. He feared what others might do if they discovered her first. Julian dismounted his horse and slowly approached, offering a small blanket from his saddle pack. "Here," he whispered, holding it out to her. "You look cold." She didn't understand the words, but the gesture of kindness was clear. Hesitating only for a moment, she draped the blanket over her shimmering skin, the weight unfamiliar but comforting. Julian noticed her tremble slightly and felt an unexpected pang of protectiveness rise in his chest. Elias, however, remained wary. He knew the desert well, and even more so, the kind of men who roamed it. "We need to leave now," Elias warned, casting a glance toward the distant horizon. "If someone else finds her out here." Julian gave a slow nod. "You're right, but we can't just leave her alone." There was no question in his mind now. She needed protection. And so, the two men decided to take her with them, not realizing the magnitude of the decision they had just made. The alien princess walked beside Julian, her bare feet gliding over the hot sand as if she barely felt the heat. Her presence was quiet but powerful. Julian felt it deep in his bones, as if her very existence demanded more than just care. It demanded understanding. As they set off across the desert, Julian couldn't shake the thought that they had stumbled upon something far greater than mere chance. The mystery of who she was, and why she had been abandoned, would haunt him with every step they took. But as the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer, and the stars began to emerge, chills spread through the desert night. And with it came the creeping knowledge that danger was not far behind. Elias kept a wary eye on the princess. "She'll attract trouble," he muttered as the group trudged onward. Julian glanced at her, this alien girl with glowing skin and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of galaxies. Despite the odds, he couldn't help but feel that perhaps she wasn't just here by accident. Perhaps, in some strange way, she was meant to be found. But in the darkening desert, unknown to any of them, other eyes had already seen her. Whispers of her existence were spreading through the scattered villages and nomadic camps. And not everyone who heard those whispers had kind intentions. The group marched into the night, unaware that every step forward brought them closer to a danger that neither human nor alien could predict. The desert night wrapped itself around them like a cloak, the stars stretching endlessly across the sky. The cold crept in swiftly, biting at their skin as the alien princess walked quietly beside Julian. Every step forward seemed to pull them deeper into uncertainty, into a mystery none of them could fully comprehend. Julian couldn't shake the feeling that the princess's arrival was more than a coincidence. He glanced at her now, and then, her silver blue hair catching moonlight like threads of starlight, her skin glowing faintly in the dark. There was a haunting beauty about her, something that felt both fragile and infinite. It tugged at him, not in desire, but in a way he couldn't explain, like she was a puzzle he was desperate to solve. Elias, riding just ahead, remained tense. His hand hovered near the hilt of a short knife tucked into his belt. He'd seen what desperation did to men. Out here in the desert, beauty was often met with violence. And this girl, this alien, was unlike anything they had encountered before. "She'll attract trouble," he thought grimly. The princess, sensing the tension between them, walked in silence. Her mind was a whirlpool of questions. Why had her mother abandoned her? What kind of creatures were these humans? Could she trust them? She studied Julian's kind face in the moonlight and felt something stir within her, something foreign, something her mother had warned her about. But she couldn't name it. They stopped near a small outcrop of jagged rocks, setting up camp for the night. Julian gathered wood to build a fire while Elias kept watch. The princess sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames as they flickered and danced. She had never seen fire before. It mesmerized her, and for a moment, she forgot her fears. Julian sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He offered her a piece of dried fruit from his pack. "Here," he said softly, "you must be hungry." She hesitated for a second before accepting it, her delicate fingers brushing against his. Julian felt an unexpected jolt run through him, not just from her touch, but from the strange, undeniable connection forming between them. It was as if some invisible force bound them together, something neither of them fully understood. "Where do you think she came from?" Julian whispered to Elias, keeping his voice low. Elias shook his head. "Doesn't matter. What matters is keeping her alive." He cast a suspicious glance toward the girl. "And keeping her hidden." Julian nodded, but something about Elias's tone unsettled him. He could see it in the older man's eyes. A flicker of something dark, something dangerous. It wasn't desire, not yet, but it was close. And Julian knew that if Elias could feel it, others would too. Far away, beyond the flickering campfire, Another figure crouched among the rocks. Hidden in the shadows, a scout from a nearby village had been following them. He had heard the rumors, an alien beauty left stranded in the desert, irresistible to the men who found her. The whispers had spread quickly, and now he knew the stories were true. The scout watched as the princess sat beside Julian, her glow like a beacon in the night. He knew what such beauty would be worth to the right buyers. Slavers would pay a fortune for someone like her. His lips curled into a greedy smile. He turned and slipped away into the darkness, his heart racing with excitement. By dawn, others would know where to find her, and they would not come with kind intentions. Back at the camp, Julian shifted uneasily. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. The desert had a way of playing tricks on the mind, but this was different. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Elias leaned closer to the fire, his voice low and rough. "We move at first light. This place isn't safe." Julian nodded, but before he could respond, the princess reached out and touched his arm, just the barest brush of her fingers, but it stopped him cold. She looked at him, her emerald eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. It was more than gratitude. There was a sadness in her gaze, a loneliness that ran deep. "You'll be safe," Julian whispered, unsure if she understood his words but needing to say them anyway. "I promise." The princess tilted her head slightly, as if trying to grasp the meaning behind his words. There was something different about this human, something kind, something good. And for the first time since her abandonment, she felt a flicker of hope. But hope, she knew, was fragile, and it wouldn't be long before the desert tested it. As the night deepened, Elias stood watch, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He was no fool. He knew they were being followed. It was only a matter of time before others came for the alien girl. And when they did, things would get ugly. Julian, exhausted from the long day, drifted off to sleep beside the fire. The princess sat quietly beside him, her glowing skin casting a soft light over his peaceful face. She watched him sleep, feeling a strange sense of comfort in his presence. But Elias couldn't rest. His instincts screamed at him that danger was close. He gripped his knife tighter, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. If they were attacked, he would do whatever it took to protect the girl, even if it meant leaving Julian behind. And then there was the matter of the girl herself. Elias didn't trust her. She was too beautiful, too perfect. He had seen men lose their minds over less, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was more dangerous than she appeared. As the fire crackled softly, Elias's thoughts darkened. What if Julian was already too attached to her? What if she was using him, manipulating him without even realizing it? Elias didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing for certain. The longer they stayed with her, the greater the risk. And if it came down to it, he would make the hard choice. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert, painting the sands in hues of gold and amber. Julian stirred from his sleep, rubbing his eyes as the camp stirred to life. The fire had long since burned down to embers, and the chill of the night was still in the air. The alien princess was awake, sitting cross-legged near the remains of the fire, watching the sunrise with quiet fascination. Her silver-blue hair shimmered under the morning light, and Julian couldn't help but marvel at how serene she looked despite everything. But this moment of peace was short-lived. Elias, ever alert, kicked sand onto the embers and motioned for Julian to gather their things. "We move now," he said, his voice sharp. "We've stayed here too long." Julian nodded and started packing, but the unease from the night before still clung to him. Something felt off, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. He glanced at the princess, who gave him a small, uncertain smile. He smiled back, though the knot in his chest only tightened. They mounted their horses, Julian riding with the princess seated behind him, her arms wrapped lightly around his waist. The warmth of her touch sent a strange, comforting sensation through him, though it also deepened his resolve. I won't let anything happen to her." As they rode across the shifting dunes, the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Julian wanted to ask Elias what his plan was, but he knew better. Elias was not one to share more than necessary. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the heat returned. The air shimmered, making it harder to see far ahead. They pressed on, the rocky cliffs in the distance offering the promise of shade and shelter. But the danger came not from ahead. It came from behind. Without warning, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Before Julian could react, a group of armed men burst from the dunes behind them, riding fast and hard. They were slavers, drawn by the whispers of an alien beauty lost in the desert. And now, they had found her. "Ride!" Elias shouted, drawing his knife as the slavers closed in. Julian kicked his horse into a gallop, the princess clinging tightly to him. His heart pounded as the desert blurred around them. The slavers were fast, their shouts and laughter filling the air as they gave chase. Elias rode ahead, weaving through the dunes, trying to lose their pursuers. But the slavers knew the desert well, and they were relentless. One of the men drew a whip, cracking it in the air as he closed the distance. "Hand over the girl, and we might let you live," he called, grinning wickedly. Julian's jaw tightened. Not a chance. He spurred his horse faster, but the slavers were closing in. One of them reached out, grabbing at the princess's cloak. She gasped, holding tightly to Julian as he swerved, barely escaping the grasp of their attackers. Elias cursed under his breath. "We can't outrun them," he shouted over his shoulder. "We have to fight." Julian knew he was right. They couldn't outrun the slavers, not in this heat, not with the princess slowing them down. But the thought of fighting terrified him. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a scavenger, a wanderer. How am I supposed to fight these men? But then he felt the princess's hand on his arm. Light, reassuring touch. He glanced back at her, and in her eyes he saw something unexpected. Trust. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Julian pulled his horse to a stop, his heart racing. "Stay behind me," he whispered to the princess as he dismounted, drawing the small knife from his belt. It felt pitifully small in his hand, but it was all he had. The slavers circled them like vultures, laughing at the sight of Julian standing alone with his knife. "You think you can stop us with that little thing?" One of them sneered, drawing a sword from his belt. Julian's grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles white. Fear clawed at his mind, but he forced it down. He had to protect her, no matter what. The first slaver lunged, swinging his sword in a wide arc. Julian ducked, his movements fueled more by instinct than skill. He slashed upward with the knife, catching the man's arm. The slaver hissed in pain, staggering back. Before Julian could catch his breath, another slaver attacked. This one was faster, more skilled. Julian barely managed to block the blow, the force of it knocking him to the ground. The slaver loomed over him, a wicked grin on his face. But before he could strike, a sudden flash of silver-blue hair appeared behind him. The princess moved with surprising speed, grabbing a handful of sand and throwing it into the slaver's eyes. He cried out, stumbling backward. Julian seized the opportunity, driving his knife into the man's leg. The slaver collapsed with a scream, clutching his wounded limb. The other slavers hesitated, taken aback by the unexpected resistance. They had expected an easy prize, an alien girl, helpless and alone. But now, they realized they had underestimated their prey. Elias, seeing the tide shift, leaped from his horse and joined the fight. With brutal efficiency, he dispatched two of the slavers, his knife flashing in the sunlight. The remaining men, realizing they were outmatched, cursed and fled into the desert. Julian staggered to his feet, panting. His hands were shaking, and his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. But they had won. They had survived. Julian turned to the princess, who stood quietly beside him, her gaze steady. She wasn't trembling, wasn't crying. She looked at him with a calm, almost knowing expression, as if she had expected this all along. Elias wiped the blood from his knife and gave Julian a nod of approval. "Not bad, kid," he muttered. "You've got guts." Julian didn't respond. He could still feel the weight of the fight pressing down on him, the fear and adrenaline mixing into a strange, heavy fog. But as the princess stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, the fog lifted just a little. "We need to keep moving," Elias said, glancing toward the horizon. "There will be more of them. They know she's here now." Julian nodded, but his mind was already racing. This was only the beginning. He could feel it. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He glanced at the princess, her glowing skin shimmering under the harsh desert sun. She wasn't just a burden to protect, she was something far more. And the world would come for her. But as they mounted their horses and set off once more into the endless desert, Julian made a silent promise to himself. "No matter what, I won't let them take her." The sun hung high overhead, relentless and unforgiving, as Julian, Elias, and the princess rode deeper into the desert. Each mile they traveled weighed heavily on Julian's mind. The fight with the slavers had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Survival, it seemed, was a more fragile thing than he had ever imagined. Elias rode silently ahead, always watching the horizon, always tense. Julian could see the shift in him, a growing suspicion, a paranoia that clung to him like a shadow. It was clear Elias didn't fully trust the princess. And Julian wasn't sure if he did either. The princess, riding behind Julian, remained quiet. Her arms were wrapped lightly around his waist, but the closeness between them did little to ease his doubts. He couldn't stop wondering. What was she hiding? Why had her own kind abandoned her? And what if Elias was right? What if she was more dangerous than she seemed? But even as these thoughts swirled in his mind, Julian knew one thing with certainty. He couldn't abandon her. Not now. Not after everything. As the group reached the base of a rocky plateau, they stopped to rest. The shade provided some relief from the heat, but the tension between them remained. Julian gave the princess some water, which she accepted with a small nod. Elias crouched nearby, sharpening his knife on a flat stone. His eyes flicked between Julian and the princess, his expression unreadable. "We need a plan," Elias said at last, his voice low. "If those slavers come back, and they will, we won't get lucky twice." Julian nodded. "We keep moving until we find the ruins." "You said they'd be safe." "They'll be safer than out here," Elias muttered, "but only if we don't draw attention." Julian glanced at the princess. "She can't help how she looks." Elias snorted. "It's not just about how she looks, kid. It's what she is. You think those slavers were the only ones looking for her? News travels fast out here. Every scavenger and cutthroat in the region will be after us soon." The princess listened quietly, her expression calm but distant. It was impossible to tell what she was thinking, or if she even understood the full extent of the danger they were in. Julian sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what are you saying? We leave her behind?" Elias's gaze darkened. "I'm saying we need to be smart. If it's between us or her, we do what we have to do." Julian's stomach twisted at the thought, but he said nothing. He didn't want to admit it, but a part of him knew Elias was right. Out here, kindness could get you killed. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the group prepared to move again. The ruins were still a day's ride away, but they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Julian helped the princess onto the horse, her touch as light as a breeze. There was something almost otherworldly about her, something that made it hard to think clearly when she was near. They rode in silence for several hours, the desert stretching endlessly in all directions. The silence between Julian and Elias was heavy, thick with unspoken words. And then, without warning, Elias reined in his horse and turned to face Julian. "We need to talk," Elias said, his voice low and serious. alone. Julian glanced at the princess, who looked back at him with a curious expression. "Stay here," Julian whispered to her, then dismounted and followed Elias a short distance away. Elias's expression was hard, his jaw clenched. "You need to decide where your loyalties lie, kid. With me, or with her?" Julian blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "I have seen how you look at her," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "You're thinking with your heart, not your head. And that's going to get us both killed." Julian felt his temper rise. "She's not a threat, Elias. She needs our help." Elias shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? She's not like us. She's dangerous, whether she knows it or not. And if you keep thinking you can save her, you'll end up dead." Julian's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not leaving her behind." Elias gave him a long, hard look. "Then you're a fool." That night, as the group made camp, the tension between Julian and Elias simmered just below the surface. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them sharp as a blade. The princess sat quietly beside Julian, her glowing skin casting soft light onto the sand. Julian felt the weight of Elias's warning pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. "I'll protect her, no matter what." As the fire burned low, Julian's eyelids grew heavy. The day's exhaustion was catching up to him, and sleep crept in like a thief. But in the dark, Elias was wide awake. He waited until Julian was sound asleep, then rose silently from his place by the fire. His hand went to the knife at his belt, his expression grim. The princess, sensing the shift in the air, opened her eyes and saw Elias standing over Julian, his knife drawn. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. Instead, she watched as Elias stood there, the firelight flickering across his face. He hesitated for a moment, just long enough for doubt to creep in. And then, with a frustrated curse, he put the knife away and walked off into the night, leaving Julian and the princess behind. When Julian woke the next morning, Elias was gone. At first, Julian thought he might have gone to scout ahead, but as the minutes stretched into hours, it became clear that Elias wasn't coming back. "He left us," Julian muttered, anger and disbelief bubbling in his chest. The princess watched him quietly, her expression unreadable. Julian ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. They were alone now, just him and the princess, with no map, no guide, and no idea how far the ruins were. But even as the fear threatened to overwhelm him, Julian knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up. "We'll make it," he whispered to the princess, more to himself than to her. "We'll find a way." And as they set off once more into the endless desert, Julian made a silent vow. "I won't let anyone hurt you. Not Elias, not the slavers, no one." But as the sun rose higher, and the desert stretched endlessly before them, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun merciless as Julian and the princess pressed on. Julian's muscles burned, and his throat felt raw from the dry air. The weight of Elias's betrayal hung over him like a shadow. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. They had to keep moving. The ruins Elias had mentioned might still offer safety, if they could find them in time. But with no guide, no clear direction, and danger lurking behind every dune, the odds felt impossibly stacked against them. The princess sat quietly behind Julian on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist. Despite everything, she seemed calm, as if she trusted him completely. But Julian knew better than to believe in miracles. Out here, trust could get you killed. His thoughts kept circling back to Elias. Why had he left? Julian had always thought of him as practical, even cold at times. But abandoning them in the desert was something else entirely. Was it fear, greed, or had Elias believed that Julian would eventually fall victim to the princess's strange outer? None of it mattered now. They were on their own. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when Julian heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, carried on the wind. His heart sank. They found us. He turned in the saddle, squinting against the sun. A cloud of dust rose from the dunes behind them, and within it, Julian could make out several riders. The slavers. They had returned, and this time, they had brought reinforcements. Panic surged through Julian's chest. The horse beneath him shifted nervously, sensing his fear. They couldn't outrun them, not again. The princess clutched Julian's arm tightly, her grip firm but calm, as if to say, "Trust you. You'll find a way." Julian swallowed hard. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like someone who could outsmart a pack of ruthless slavers. But he didn't have a choice. He scanned the horizon, searching for anything, anywhere they could hide, and then he saw it. A jagged outcrop of rocks jutting from the sand, not far from where they stood. "Hold on," Julian shouted, spurring the horse toward the rocks. The princess tightened her grip around him as they raced across the sand, the slavers gaining ground with every passing second. They reached the rocks just as the first arrows whistled through the air, thudding into the ground behind them. Julian dismounted quickly, helping the princess down as they scrambled toward the narrow crevice between the rocks. "Go," Julian urged her, glancing over his shoulder. The slavers were closing in fast. The princess slipped into the crevice, her glowing skin casting faint light onto the stone walls. Julian followed, squeezing through the tight space just as the slavers reached the rocks. The slavers surrounded the rocks, their laughter echoing through the desert. Julian pressed his back against the stone, his knife clenched tightly in his hand. The princess stood beside him, her eyes wide but calm. "They know we're here," Julian whispered. "We have to fight." The princess nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitability of what was to come. Julian didn't know if she understood what was at stake, but he admired her courage. A voice echoed from outside the rocks. "Come out, boy," one of the slavers called, his tone mocking. "Hand over the girl, and we might let you live." Julian's jaw tightened. "Not a chance," he muttered under his breath. The slavers laughed again. "Suit yourself," the leader sneered. "We'll come in and take her ourselves." Julian felt his pulse quicken. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outmatched, but he wasn't going down without a fight. As the slavers began to climb over the rocks, Julian prepared himself for the worst. But just as the first man reached the top, something strange happened. The princess stepped forward, her glowing skin shimmering brighter than ever before. The slaver froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at her, mesmerized, as if he had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. Julian watched in stunned silence as the princess's presence seemed to overwhelm the man's senses. He dropped his weapon, his expression slack with awe. What is she?" the slaver muttered, his voice trembling. The other slavers, seeing their comrade's reaction, hesitated. The glow from the princess seemed to cast a spell over them, dulling their anger and greed. For a moment, it was as if they had forgotten why they had come. Julian's mind raced. This is her power, the same power that had kept her safe from Elias, and the same power that had drawn these men to her in the first place. But it wasn't just beauty. It was something deeper, something that resonated with the very essence of human desire and fear. It was as if the princess embodied everything they longed for, and everything they feared to lose. Julian didn't waste the opportunity. While the slavers stood frozen, he moved quickly, grabbing the leader's fallen weapon. "Get back," Julian shouted, brandishing the sword. The slavers, still dazed by the princess's presence, stumbled backward, their confidence shaken. Julian could see the fear creeping into their eyes, the realization that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. "This isn't over," the leader snarled, his voice shaky but defiant. "We'll be back." Julian leveled the sword at him. "Not if I see you first." The slavers retreated slowly, casting nervous glances at the princess as they backed away. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the desert like ghosts. Julian let out a long breath, his heart still racing. He turned to the princess, who stood quietly beside him, her glow dimming as the danger passed. "Thank you," Julian whispered, though he wasn't sure if she understood. The princess gave him a small, knowing smile, a smile that seemed to say, "I knew you could do it." As the sun set over the desert, Julian and the princess sat together in the shadow of the rocks, the weight of the day's events slowly lifting from their shoulders. "We'll make it," Julian whispered, more to himself than to her. "We have to." The princess rested her head lightly against his shoulder, her trust in him unwavering. And for the first time since they had begun this journey, Julian felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the danger was far from over. But as they sat together under the stars, Julian knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun rose once more, casting long shadows across the dunes as Julian and the princess pressed forward. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Julian's body, but he pushed himself onward, driven by the promise of the ruins Elias had spoken of. With no clear map or guide, every step felt like a gamble, but he knew they were close. They had to be. The princess, as always, remained silent but observant. Despite the trials they had faced, she moved with a grace that seemed unaffected by the desert's harshness. Julian often found himself drawing strength from her presence. Her unwavering trust in him gave him the will to keep going. And then, at last, they saw it. The ruins emerged from the horizon like the bones of a long-dead beast, crumbling stone walls half buried in the sand, ancient pillars twisted by time and wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and Julian hoped it would be enough to keep them safe. They approached cautiously, leading their horse through the narrow entrance. Inside, the air was cooler, and the shadows felt like a blessing after the relentless heat. Julian let out a sigh of relief. They had made it. But as they explored deeper into the ruins, a new question began to gnaw at Julian's mind. What now? They had escaped the slavers, for now. But how long could they stay hidden? And more importantly, how could he protect the princess from the dangers that would inevitably come? As night fell over the ruins, Julian and the princess settled near a small fire. The silence between them felt more comfortable now, like an unspoken understanding. But just as Julian began to relax, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. He sprang to his feet, drawing his knife as a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, ragged and dusty from the desert, but alive. "Elias," Julian whispered in disbelief. Elias gave a weary nod, his face etched with guilt and exhaustion. "I came back," he muttered, his voice hoarse. I thought I could leave you behind, but I was wrong." Julian stared at him, torn between anger and relief. "Why did you leave?" Elias shook his head, unable to meet Julian's gaze. "I was scared of what she is, of what she might do to us." He glanced at the princess, who watched him with calm, unblinking eyes. "But I couldn't leave you out here alone. I knew the slavers would come back, and you're the only family I have, kid." Julian's anger slowly ebbed, replaced by a cautious sense of gratitude. He didn't fully trust Elias, not yet, but they needed each other now more than ever. "Let's just focus on surviving," Julian said quietly. "We can figure the rest out later." Elias gave a curt nod. Agreed. The next morning, Julian, Elias, and the princess explored the ruins, searching for anything that might help them survive: food, water, weapons. But as they scoured the ancient walls, Julian felt a growing sense of unease. The ruins were too quiet. And then he saw it: movement in the distance. A group of figures, silhouetted against the rising sun, making their way toward the ruins. Julian's heart sank. The slavers had returned, and this time They had brought more men. We can't fight them all. Elias muttered, his voice grim. Not out here. Julian's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the slavers, not with the princess slowing them down. And they couldn't fight. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. He turned to the princess, his heart pounding. Do you trust me? She looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes, and nodded. Julian gave a small, determined smile. Good. As the slavers approached the ruins, Julian and Elias moved quickly, setting a trap. They blocked off the narrow entrance with debris, forcing the slavers to approach from a single, vulnerable angle. Then, Julian did something risky, something desperate. He stepped out into the open, standing in full view of the approaching slavers. I know why you're here, he called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. You want her, but she's not what you think. The slaver leader sneered. And what exactly is she, boy? Julian took a slow, deliberate step forward. She's not just an alien. She's a weapon. A living, breathing weapon. And if you take her, you'll regret it. The slavers hesitated, their confidence wavering. Julian could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. Go on, Julian continued, his voice rising. Touch her. See what happens. But I'm warning you, you won't survive it. The princess, standing silently behind him, radiated a soft, ethereal glow. It wasn't just beauty, it was something more. Something that made the slavers falter, their fear outweighing their greed. The leader cursed under his breath. Let's go, he muttered, turning away. She's not worth it. And just like that, the slavers retreated into the desert, their footsteps fading into the distance. Julian let out a shaky breath, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The princess stepped closer, her gaze filled with quiet gratitude. You did it, Elias whispered, clapping Julian on the back. I didn't think it would work, but you did it. Julian gave a small, tired smile. Yeah, we did. As the sun set over the ruins, Julian, Elias, and the princess sat together by the fire, the weight of their journey finally lifting from their shoulders. We made it, Julian whispered, glancing at the princess. We're safe. For now, at least. The desert had released them from its grasp, but Julian knew that their journey was far from over. The world beyond the ruins was vast and dangerous, filled with people who would stop at nothing to possess the princess and her strange, otherworldly power. But for the first time since they had begun this journey, Julian felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. Together, they had faced betrayal, danger, and fear, and together, they had survived. And whatever came next, Julian knew they would face it the same way. As a family. The princess gave Julian a small, knowing smile, a smile that seemed to say, "We'll be okay." And as the stars began to emerge overhead, Julian smiled back, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together.